Okay.
This is John Drummond, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. And by the way, as we've often said, we're closing in on 80 shows, and it's been another great day for British democracy. As you know, there's been a tsunami of sleaze and corruption at Westminster. So much indeed that the British government is now reckoned to be the best that money can buy. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we'll be talking to Julian Caldecott, who describes himself as an ecologist on a mission. And you'll learn shortly how important that mission is and the enormous contribution he is making to this whole hugely important subject. We'll be discussing his views on COP26, why he thinks ecology ought to be enshrined in a Scottish constitution, and all other constitutions, and what he thinks of independence, and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. Details are on the What's On guide, and you can find that at whatsonguide.scot. TNT, as you know, stands for Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Come and join us tonight. And now to our guest. Tonight, the Nation talks to Julian Caldecott. How are you, Julian?
Well, very well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me on, and good evening to all.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. Take us through your backstory, if I can call it that, Julian. How you ended up where you are, and why ecology?
Well, why ecology was probably because I watched Daktari on the telly as a kid, but that sort of set me going. But basically, I got into badger watching, and then took a year off before going to university and was a volunteer on a project studying elephants in Malaya, and that led me to then a study on gibbons, and then I did my PhD on monkeys, and then went to Borneo to look at bearded pigs and then rhinos. And so the whole process was just getting more and more involved in tropical wildlife, rainforesty kind of things. And so I naturally, my career, if you can call it that, naturally turned into consulting on biodiversity conservation kind of issues, which back in the 90s were quite important because the Convention on Biological Diversity was signed in 1992, and all the donor agencies got very excited, and there was a lot of money going into that stuff. And there was real interest in conserving nature at the time. And so since that's what I wanted to do, that was my mission, I was working on that. And then gradually the mission, or at least the donor interest evolved, and it became not so much about biodiversity, more about climate change, more about conserving rainforest carbon stores, and that whole thing about reduced deforestation as a way of preventing emissions. And so what they call RED plus. And so that became a speciality, because of course it combines, my interest of conserving tropical nature and enormous numbers of species in rainforests with doing something useful for the world in terms of climate change. And so that's I spent 15 years on that sort of work. So that's how I got into climate change anyway.
And you work with governments. You work with the EC, Denmark, Norway, the UK. You worked with the World Bank. And I gather that you've advised on programs, aid programs amounting to 10 billion euros.
Yeah, that's my back of an envelope calculation of the total value of the projects or the programs I've evaluated over the years. That all sounds a bit theoretical, but a lot of this stuff is about actual projects that are actually drawing lines on the ground with villagers, demarcating boundaries of national parks and protected areas. So there's a kind of useful stuff as well in there. It's not just donor agency bureaucracy. I try and keep it as real as possible, and also because it's quite I spend all my time scurrying around, or I have spent most of my time scurrying around the world doing this stuff. I figured that what I should do is take a few months out every now and again and write it all down, which is why every 6 to 10 years I produce a book that basically summarizes and explains what I've been learning about all this stuff. So in the 90s I started off with a book about conservation projects, and then wrote a book about water, and then on great apes, and then more recently on aid performance and climate change, basically focused on mitigation. And now very recently, just come out, was my book on surviving climate chaos, which is more or less about adaptation.
And how do people get a copy of your book? Where do they go, Julian? Can they get it from you, or do they get it from Amazon, or what would you prefer?
Oh, well, any good bookshop, including Amazon, would be fine.
And who are the publishers?
Oh, sorry, Cambridge University Press.
Okay, and the book again is called
Surviving Climate Chaos.
Climate Chaos. Okay.
Climate chaos, yes. And I say
chaos. Just a brief summary, because obviously it would be really good if people went out and bought a copy of the book, because they'll, we've only got an hour tonight. Sounds like a long time, but we've got a lot of ground to cover. And I imagine you would prefer that people have a copy of the book to hand so they can get some in-depth knowledge and information. How would you summarize, if you had to summarize the book in a couple of paragraphs, what would you say? Well,
of course, my aim is to write these things in order to make myself obsolete. I mean, but this particular book, Chaos, is about, because I was worried that people are thinking in terms of climate change only, and they're thinking in terms of predictable sea level rise and desertification and large scale things like that, which governments think of as an excuse really to pour concrete or resettle people or build large works, which only addresses some of the issue. I was thinking that chaos is more to the point, because what you get is at the local level, it's very hard to predict how climate change is going to manifest itself. So what you're actually getting is unpredictable impacts of all sorts of different kinds: floods, droughts, tidal wave, storm surges, things of this sort, diseases, fires, which are very hard to predict in detail. So I was thinking that what you should do is actually strengthen the ecological systems and the societies everywhere in order to make everybody stronger against random impacts. And so that's the essence of the book, is to try and encourage people and agencies and governments to think in terms of what is it about complex systems like societies and ecosystems? What is it about them that make them vulnerable, and what is it about them that make them strong, and strong enough to resist a whole range of different kind of impacts? And so I look into the question of system, different kinds of systems, and what are the general principles involved, and how does that work actually out? How does that actually work out in practice? What is it about a project that strengthens a system? And what prompted this was looking at some Danish projects back in the 2000s, which were beautiful. They were great projects that had strengthened systems magnificently. And then the Danish government just walked away from them and they collapsed. Now, I was thinking, well, why did they do that? What is it they didn't understand about the projects that were so, why didn't they understand that they were so good and needed to continue? Okay, so that was a starting point for the book, to try and explain what it is about a good project in terms of strengthening systems to resist climate chaos.
I'm interested, why did the Danish government has always struck me as somewhat enlightened compared to some others we could talk about. What prompted them to walk away from what sounded like a very worthwhile process?
Well, there's two things really. First, I concluded firstly that they hadn't quite appreciated the significance of the projects, and secondly, possibly more importantly, they had let's say a right-wing moment where the mid-2010s, where they they had a Conservative government that wasn't really interested in the subtleties of aid and development and sustainability and things. You know how it is. Now they've got a much sort of greener, redder sort of government that is restoring some of this stuff. So there are kind of connections. Well, whether for good or ill, there are connections between the kind of flavour of government people vote for and whether those people can really be expected to take this kind of complexity seriously. And, you know, make no mistake, this climate change issue and the climate emergency and the ecological emergency are the most complicated things that humanity's ever had to deal with. So it really calls for good leadership, essentially, good people, you know, intelligent voters, ecological literacy, as well as a whole range of other positives. So it's a bit of a tall order, but it's not impossible. There are places that do it very well.
Well, we've got your website on screen for people to go there. Are your books listed on the website?
They certainly are.
Excellent. So people can get all the information they need there. Presumably prices as well, Julian?
Yep. Yeah. Sure.
Excellent. What does your latest book cost? Just a matter of interest.
It's in paper. Well, I recommend the paperback. Actually, the Kindle is a tenner or something. The paperback is
okay.
20 quid or something like that. It's you know, I'm still searching for a publisher agent for a kind of much more popular kind of book. I'm a feeling that it's about time to boil all this down into a Peace with Nature book that tells it all in a much more simple sort of way. But my current book, I have to say, is a dipper, really. You dip into it, it's full of little nuggets of stuff. I wouldn't recommend anyone reading it cover to cover, really. But it's a good reference, well worth it.
Excellent. Well, it's important. Give us a nugget right now.
Oh, well, one nugget, of course, is what I mentioned just now, the Peace with Nature idea, which sort of permeates the book in a technical sort of way, but continuously or often referring back to this the inspiration I had in the 90s from a country called Costa Rica, which is a small country in Central America, which back in the 80s invented a fantastic system for conserving, teaching about, learning about, and commercializing, or, you know, finding uses for their biodiversity, but always for the benefit of local Costa Ricans in the localities around the protected areas. So there's a whole reform process of localizing the protected areas and then researching their 500,000 species and finding out what they're good for. And in that period in the 90s, there were these bioprospecting contracts and so forth with big pharmaceutical companies and things to try and find new medicines in the rainforest, but always with benefiting Costa Rica, with a share going back to protect the protected areas. All of which has moved on a lot in Costa Rica, because that was the beginning of a whole trajectory of legislative change that resulted in a payment for ecosystem services arrangement that reversed their deforestation rate, which was previously one of the highest in the world, stabilized the whole country environmentally, and now Costa Rica is, after 30 years of that, is a world leader in all of all this thinking about how to do this work. And I'm very pleased to see that Nicola Sturgeon and Cristiana Figueres from Costa Rica were on telly the other day talking about how these small countries can work together to spark really interesting new ideas off each other and create a kind of new level of leadership. Now, I know that Scotland also has been working with Iceland and New Zealand on a well-being economy platform, which is another great initiative, but it sort of fits together. So the Peace with Nature, yes, is certainly is a model for many of the, or many aspects of it are relevant to all of these case studies and examples in the book. And I don't know, it leads on to, well, basically, John, you mentioned my mission at the very beginning. I was just thinking that I was wondering before this show what my mission actually is. I guess it's to try and bring to an end humanity's war with nature and to promote peace with nature. And that's probably it. But the question arises of what on earth peace with nature would look like. And we're still working on that, but we got some good ideas. The Costa Rican model is one, of course, which could be learned from in Scotland and in many other countries. There's also, I don't know if you remember the Citizens Climate Assembly that happened last year. I did a proposal to them for a constitutional provision in a new Scottish constitution. I'm sort of quite enthusiastic about the idea of a written constitution and an independent Scotland, which we can come back to. But the idea of writing into the constitution that nature has the laws of ecology are actually superior to the laws passed by parliaments, by human laws. So the idea of having accepted that ecological laws somehow take precedence over human laws, how do you actually make that a real factor? How do you write it into the constitution, not just as a sort of slogan, we must all be nice to nature because it's good, but how do we actually set up systems that can protect people, citizens, future generations, and non-human species from bad decisions by politicians? Essentially, proposing a kind of an ecological court of appeal to potentially review laws and potentially strike them down if they don't stack up. Anyway, that was just one idea. It was actually the most popular of the proposals that were put to the assembly, which is nice. So I think there's some legs there. There's some potential there, but it's all very much up in the air. We have these huge, as I said, complex challenges before us, and I'm sure you've been following what's been going on in the COP26 discussions, which are somewhere between blah, blah, blah and really useful. And it's a bit hard to tell, of course. I've got my own opinions, which I'm happy to share with you if you want.
Yeah, do. What do you think of COP26?
Well, as you know, they're kind of the two great themes in climate change. The climate change subject. One is adaptation, as in how do we respond to, cope with, survive, manage the consequences of changing climate, and that would apply regardless of how and why the climate's changed, of course. But we do understand that it's a human action causing it. But in any case, that has consequences, and we need to work out how to respond to them. And then there's the other issue of mitigation. How do we somehow head this off before it gets completely unmanageable? And the mitigation side has always somehow had the most political traction in the West, because people are scared. They've become increasingly scared since the 80s. So people have become steadily more scared about the likely scenarios involving our global climate system and what that would mean. And indeed, it is very scary. So there's this whole process of the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assembling scientific work every few years to produce a kind of government advisory on where the science is, which is always, because it's always based on peer-reviewed published journal articles, it's always 2 or 3 years behind the truth. And so if you actually talk to people who work on climate change, they're usually much more worried than the IPCC reports would indicate. So there's this kind of fear, and that's feeding certainly into it has activated, I guess, the great movements we've seen since 2018. Which, in a way, I've been waiting for all my life. Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion. have finally nailed it. They've finally nailed the issue that we're actually dicing with death on a huge scale, both of our species and of all other species in a mass extinction situation. And they see that very clearly, and they're very determined. I was actually at the launch of Extinction Rebellion in October 2018, which was also blessed by Greta Thunberg at the time. So it was all feeling great. And so I've been very much, encouraging them and so forth from a distance. But on the other hand, my job as a consultant has been made hugely more easy by Greta and Extinction Rebellion providing this pressure. You know, the governments I work for are now, whereas 3 years ago they were saying, no, we can't accept this radical proposal for change because it's all too difficult. Now they're saying, oh, well, that proposal is not radical enough. We want to really make a difference. And that, to my mind, is a fantastic result. And that is purely due, I think, to pressure from the street. So XR and Greta, please continue. However, the point is that they've got a unfortunately very valid point that we are rapidly heading towards a big problem. And I think, and this is one comment. I mean, this adaptation mitigation issue. I mean, I already talked about adaptation in saying that I think they've, you know, the aid community has sort of missed the point of strengthening localities, local systems, local communities, and needs to do a lot more of that. And that's what my book is about. And that's, you know, how to be a responsible aid agency is in that book, and that's what it says we should do. On the mitigation front, I've got another problem, which is that I think they've got their sums wrong from all of their calculations, or all of our, I suppose, calculations of how to compare different mitigation investments, that is, investments designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The donor agencies, the governments, the companies are always thinking about cost per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent as if carbon dioxide equivalent was a standard unit. However, my belief, or my conclusion, is that carbon dioxide equivalence changes over time. And the reason for that is that we're heading for at the present time, we're heading for a mid-century climate breakdown, probably because of tipping points in the oceans, in the equatorial tropics, and in the Arctic specifically. The Arctic one is very clearly visualizable, and you'll see it on my website as and I put it in the book, of course, is the Arctic death spiral. As a good friend of mine has been working on the volume of sea ice in the Arctic since 1979 and plotting it out by month, and you can see the ice getting thinner and thinner and more transient over time. And so the Arctic sea ice is spiraling down. It looks like it's going to hit zero in the 2030s at some point in the 2030s maximum. Now at that point, I fear, well, and I mean, I don't know much about this, to be honest, but polar ice people that I have talked to fear, and books I've read suggest that when the last ice goes, the Arctic Ocean will heat up very rapidly because of well, basically ice takes a lot more heat to melt than water takes to heat up. So when the last ice goes, the water will heat up much more, and there'll be a lot of methane released. I mean, we're talking 1 trillion tons or so, and that will be curtains possibly. So, and that on top of the Amazon problem, we're down to within a couple of % of a situation where the Amazon might well turn wholesale into a fire-maintained grassland rather than rainforest. You know, these are kind of major tipping points that could well happen in the next couple of decades.
Just a small point of information. Are you saying that there's methane locked up in the Arctic ice? Is that, or is it underneath the Arctic ice that the methane is? is
sorry.
captured.
Yeah, no, it's in the, well, I believe it's in the seabed, and also, and I think more importantly, in the frozen permafrost tundra, which is basically frozen peat, wet peat that has been stored up there for, and we're talking about the whole Siberia, the whole of Canada.
Yeah.
So
I want
a
to
lot
take a
of
couple of questions, if I may, Julian, very quickly. Alistair Bryan is asking, how can we ensure, it's a very good point, this, it seems to me, how can we ensure that big business and corporations don't lobby our politicians to water down environmental and climate protection? How can we build in safeguards to prevent that from happening?
That's fundamentally a question about governance, is it not? I mean, how do you make corporations do anything? You have to regulate, and you have to supervise, and you have to inspect, and if necessary punish. The problem that in the old days, that didn't, when I was a nipper, that didn't seem to be a problem for regulating corporations, but since Margaret Thatcher, I think it's become increasingly more difficult. So what can I say?
Well, I mean, you're right, it's down to governments in the end. So what is your sense of the Scottish government? How good a job is it doing, would you say?
Well, don't forget I'm a newcomer, and there's been a lockdown that's closed things, prevented me doing as much networking as I would like. But my general impression is that the attitude of the Scottish government is positive, open, interested, creative, and intelligent, which is quite a major difference I found when I came here. But then I could say the same about Scottish society. I mean, the government reflects society more truly here in Scotland than the English government does in England, I think, except insofar maybe as that England is rather polarised, and the government is quite polarised as well, or it has gone through an episode like that. However, of course, there are issues and problems. I'm massively encouraged by the entry of, I mean, I'm a member of the Scottish Greens, and I'm of course very pleased that they've now joined the government. So we've got two ministers there keeping an eye on things, and they're very good ministers too.
Have they had an effect? I mean, have you seen any differences in policy or procedure that make you think, that confirm you that they're having this effect that you say?
Well, I have not specifically. However, these ministers talk to each other, I think, and as I said, I was watching Nicola Sturgeon on the telly the other day, and she seemed very well up to speed on some of these major biodiversity and sustainable development and well-being economy and almost peace with nature sort of ideas, and so all that's rather encouraging. But others would know better than I think.
But isn't there a problem that, I mean, I think she describes her approach as a sub-state activity, i.e. in the same way that I assume a Canadian province would be a sub-state body. And the difficulty with being a sub-state body is the sovereign body can then completely overrule, if it wishes, any sub-state activity or progress that's been made.
That's true, and I made that point in my article about why Scotland should be independent the other day. Yes, there are a lot of things that Scotland could and should do, but it's going to be very hard doing it against the wishes of a hostile conservative hegemon, is the phrase I think I used. I mean, there are difficulties with, I mean, there are opportunities, even I mean, in a semi-autonomous situation like Scotland has, there are of course opportunities to apply pressure, to block things, to encourage things to happen. I mean, you mentioned Canada. Well, Canadian provinces have quite a lot of effect in terms of blocking things. and advancing certain agendas. So there's a lot that can still be done by Scotland, even within the Union. I was just saying that one of the advantages of independence would be that a much more coherent, focused program of restoring nature and addressing the climate issue in dialogue with lots of other countries, in engaging in a much more sort of grown-up way. A lot of things will become possible, put it that way. But even without it, you can still do a lot.
Where can people find your article, by the way?
That was on the the Sunday National on Sunday.
Okay. Was it last weekend? Do you know? Can you remember?
It was 2 or so weekends ago.
Okay.
2 or 3 weekends ago. Yes.
Well, there you are, folks. You can find out from the Sunday National Julian's comments about why independence would be a terribly good idea in these circumstances. What have you had any contact with the Scottish government, Julian?
No, not really. I recently became a trustee of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and I'm sort of hoping that somehow that will lead to some kind of meetings. I also put in some policy amendments on the Green Party conference lately about alien invasive species, and one of the Green Party ministers is in charge of biodiversity. So somehow I'm hoping that one day I'll meet these people.
Sounds to me like it'd be a good idea for everyone if that were to take place. And I hope if there's any government advisors watching tonight, listening tonight, I would strongly suggest you get in touch with Julian. It seems to me that somebody who's advised on 10 billion euros of aid programs could be very valuable to the Scottish government. But there you are. A question about desalination plant. The question is, could desalination plants help reduce sea levels while combating desertification and food production and reforestation, and aid food production and reforestation? What do you think of that?
Well, deforestation depends how it's done, of course, because major deforestation plants, such as the ones that are often built in the Middle East, require a lot of fossil energy to run them, and so they're kind of counterproductive in that way. They also have local impacts. If I was in a desert situation and the rains were becoming less and less frequent, and I had a nearby ocean and could somehow afford it, then I guess I'd build a desalination plant, because it's a necessary little thing. But it's a necessary thing locally, but it's not a solution to the big problem. It can't be, really.
You mentioned earlier that one of the big advantages, I'm paraphrasing now, but of small countries is that perhaps they're more versatile. They can perhaps generate ideas which might be taken up by larger groups, and they might provide an exemplar or a model for combating climate change and making a contribution in that regard. But isn't the problem there that the fact that the big players may choose, for whatever reason, political, whatever, to say, well, that's all very well and interesting, but only small countries can do that, and we don't plan to do anything in this regard. I'll give you an example. I mean, people claim that COP26 has been injured by the fact that that China didn't participate directly.
Well, China is a huge law unto itself, of course. On a slightly smaller scale, I was struck. Well, I mentioned when I went to Costa Rica in the early 90s before, I was on my way to start working with the Ministry of Environment in Jakarta, in the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. And I thought, when I saw the Costa Rican solution with all this decentralization, local empowerment, environment education, research, bioprospecting, all these great ideas, I thought, well, of Costa Rica has, I mean, it's a small country, but it's got 7 or 8 quite large protected areas in it. And Costa Rica itself is bigger than most Indonesian islands. I mean, why shouldn't some of this, all of these ideas, be transplanted into Indonesia? So I invited the Director General of the National Biodiversity Institute to visit Indonesia from Costa Rica, from San Jose, and he did that and gave very good talks to a lot of people. And I took some Indonesians back to Costa Rica to show them how it's done, and so there was interest. But what stopped it basically was the Indonesian Indonesian idea that Indonesia is a big, powerful country and Costa Rica is a small, tiddly little country. So what have they got to teach us? Which obviously I think misses the point that, as I said, Indonesia has made 17,000 islands, most of them much smaller than Costa Rica, and virtually all of its protected areas are smaller than Costa Rica's protected areas. And the similar numbers of people are living around these protected areas. And if you're going to stabilize land use around a protected area, you need it at a local level. I mean, those decisions and that motivation needs to be local, and the benefits need to be captured locally. You need to strengthen that level in order to defend the boundaries. And that didn't really cut it in Indonesia, but it did work quite well in the Philippines, which in that sort of period had it decentralized at a local government code that decentralized a lot down to municipalities, which in the Philippines are sort of 10,000 people units, that kind of scale. So not particularly big, which means that people are quite, the mayor of a municipality basically, you can go and meet them. They're easily enough, it's sort of accessible. And you give that level of society lots of power, and then also give them lots of environmental guidance and a bit of aid and this, that, and the other, and they'll really get involved in suppressing illegal logging and ecological restoration. So again, if your governance system is set up for that, but then of course later on the Philippines was taken over by, there was a reaction to this local empowerment agenda in favor of centralization and top-down rule, and things were undone. So all of these solutions are, well, regrettably, they can be temporary. The trick is to figure out a way of making it permanent. And of course, this is where the European Union comes in as a great model.
What do you think of the EU?
Well, I think the EU is a great thing. I like it. I know that there's a kind of tension within the EU between the great countries and the Europe of the regions, and between unregulated free trade, sort of capitalism, and local social empowerment and equity. There's all sorts of tensions in there because it's a huge, complex system. But they've got the right idea that what you need is a kind of, a strong system of small empowered units that talk to each other and solve problems together. And in a way we come back to COP26, because that's working on the Paris Agreement, which effectively was designed by the EU to reflect a sort of experimentalist governance approach, where everyone agrees on an overarching goal, and then all the different stakeholders are then free to try and work out how to meet that goal in their own way, which gives them the freedom to work. But then they have to compare notes with each other. So everyone's trying to solve the problem while looking over each other's shoulder and stealing each other's ideas. And, there's naming and shaming going on, and there's embarrassment, and there's competition. So you're all trying to compete to solve the problem, which is exactly the right way of doing things if you don't have an authority that can tell people what to do. Now, China has sort of an authority that can tell people what to do, but even in China, it has an experimentalist approach where it looks to the counties and provinces to come up with good ideas, and then studies them, and then if they're any good, it then orders that they're rolled out across the country, which is another kind of more authoritarian version of the same experimentation. But we can't do that with the Paris Agreement, because there is no global world government, and that's the way it is. So the Paris Agreement was, I think, pretty sophisticated and very good at the time. The problem is that there has been, well, there's an awful lot of complexity and backsliding and opportunism and well, there's been a lot of blah blah blah, but also a lot of greenwashing, a lot of astroturfing, a lot of distracting and rather heated debates about what we all mean by net zero and this sort of thing. I mean, if anyone's interested, I've got a very clear idea of net zero. The projects is one thing where you make sure that all of the emission costs are included in your calculations, so nothing is left out. So if you build a hydroelectric scheme, you've got to include the emissions from the trucks, from the concrete, all this sort of thing, from the dam lake, the vegetation rotting in there. That then, not just the emissions you save by using hydropower, but what we really want to do with the COP26, I guess, is what we're groping towards is the idea of a global net zero, where countries, each individual country, reduces their territorial emissions, that is what they do themselves, their consumption emissions, what they import from somewhere else, and that to as nearly to zero as they can do, and then possibly even beyond zero, in fact. And then, because not other countries will simply be unable to do that, or don't want to do that, or one reason or another, you've got to overcompensate for that. So net global zero involves a certain amount of everybody striving to be totally zero themselves or negative. We're talking carbon negative really is what we need rather than carbon neutral, as well as nature positive. Those are the two great guidelines here. And that's another criticism I have of COP, is the lack of attention to nature, I suppose. But anyway, so carbon negative, nature positive, countries do that, but then they also need to work together to help other countries achieve that. And that can involve investing in helping them in setting up national parks, protecting protected areas, and possibly helping them towards renewable energy transitions, that sort of thing. So you don't want to treat it as a kind of, the danger is that sort of offsetting is treated as an opportunity for carbon cowboys to make money, but actually there's a legitimate reason for it, provided it's in the context of a global net zero job, which we need to do urgently. In fact, we need to go global negative in terms of carbon because of the imminent tipping points I was talking about earlier. And the way to do that is to recalculate your mitigation investments to allow for the fact that carbon saved now is worth more than carbon saved in 10 years' time. So in other words, what happens in the next 10 years is critical, not what people promise to do in the 2040s and 2050s, because there's no point to that. If the crunch time is the 2030s, we need to do it now in the 2020s. Anyway, my suggestion is we do the recalculations to reflect that in the economics. That's all I would say to that.
That's very interesting. We've just had a comment, by the way, saying what an informative and interesting interview this is.
Okay, that's good.
That is good. I think you went to the demonstration last weekend. Is that right? 100,000 people marched through Glasgow.
That's right.
What were your impressions of that?
Well, for a start, I reckon it was 150,000. But anyway, it was great. These sort of demonstrations are just I find them terribly uplifting because there's so much human creativity and so much determination and so much good humour. The occasional grumpy sort of slogan or sign, but basically it's good humoured and it's creative and determined, and there's a great energy to it. And there's great drumming too from Extinction Rebellion.
Do you think we'll ever see 150,000 people marching through central London with the same object in mind?
Well, central London, yes, I should think so. We had, I think, close to 1 million people walk on the big Brexit march. I was on that. And there was similarly large numbers for the anti-war in Iraq thing. And these are, well, they're very important issues, but kind of compared with the future of life on Earth, relatively less so. I think, yeah, I'd be surprised if we haven't already had 150,000 people on the streets in London on climate change.
So what's your impression of the UK government's contribution? Well,
I should declare a family interest in the sense that my son is on the British government team in the COP and has been very instrumental in working on the climate financing, the big money side of how to achieve sustainable financing of a whole raft of initiatives, including nature, but also the carbon side. So to the extent he's been doing very good work, and all sorts of breakthroughs seem to be happening. The problem there on the finance, I don't really understand what they've achieved, because it's all money and economics, and there are a lot of jargon in there that I'm not totally au fait with, being an ecologist, you know. But they, yes, the British government, well, apart from my son and his colleagues, who tend to be very good, I have my doubts about the general tenor of the British government, as you know. And
well, one of the issues that cropped up recently that came across my desk was this idea of building, I can't remember what the terminology was, mini nuclear power stations. I mean, what is that all about?
Well, on the one hand, on the telly the other night, it was saying that basically it's a radical new design concept, modular systems and things. What they didn't say is what actually. I mean, to me, the key point is the waste issue. What do you do with the waste? And that's always been the weak link in nuclear, because no one's ever solved the problem of what you do with something that needs to be kept ultra safe for 200,000 years, or it'll escape and kill us all, or at least destroy or damage life on Earth very badly. So I wait with interest for the knowledge about what the hardware, or what it actually involves. What I never understood on nuclear issues, why I seem to remember they started off exploring thorium reactors. Maybe one of your viewers or listeners knows about thorium reactors, because I gather they don't generate anything like such dangerous wastes. But they were sort of abandoned in the 50s because they didn't create uranium and plutonium that could be used in nuclear weapons, and so they lost out to the kind of hybrid, the hand-in-hand process of the nuclear industry with the nuclear weapons industry. But thorium sounded good to me.
Well, that would be interesting to see what sort of power stations they have in mind. Charles Smith is asking if you're aware of Professor Steve Keen's efforts to include ecological damage in economics.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's not like people aren't striving. There's the donut economics theory, and there's the rights of nature legal arguments, and there's all sorts of environmental economics and law have been exploring in these directions for a long time. I mean, I did a fair amount of that myself, just turning the values of nature into dollars and cents kind of has more traction with accountants, and accountants have more traction with decision makers than ecologists do, so you try and translate them. The trouble is that the economics is a poor reflection of reality in some way. It's a good way of summarizing short-term human interests, shorthanding those so you can compare one with another, but a rather poor way of expressing deeper values, more inclusive values, longer-term values, system values, essentially, and completely hopeless when you start talking like, say, Bolivia has been doing, and a number of NGOs and a number of other countries who are now talking with Bolivia and going the same direction about the rights of Mother Earth, for example. Then we're talking about non-monetary values, non-monetarizable values of nature, because nature is of infinite value.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I can see parallels. I set up the UK's first business ethics consultancy way back when, and one of the challenges I had was to convince companies to take it seriously. And it was only when I talked about corporate tragedy that I started to get some traction. Because, it's quite evident that when you looked at corporations like Enron, what was built into their business model was the fact that it would collapse. And I mean, I wasn't the only one saying that, by the way. Others would look at it from different directions, said the same thing. But somehow it only ever got attention when you had to find some form of words to make it real, which I guess is one of the challenges that you have too, Julian, because you must look at everyday examples of illogical behavior and government behavior, and particularly in corporate behavior, and think, what do we have to say to you to convince you that this is real?
Well, I personally explored almost every conceivable way of selling something to government ministers and officials. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can form alliances, and sometimes people get it. Ministers can get it and then help. But on the Enron thing, I was thinking that I mentioned my son earlier. His name's Ben Caldecott, if you want to look him up on Wikipedia or any of the other such sources. But he virtually invented the field of stranded assets, so that you can now, and this is what people are now saying to the big oil companies, essentially, and the pension funds, that if you invest in high carbon solutions, then you will lose your money, because these assets are going to become stranded very quickly. And Al Gore, in fact, was saying the other day that it could well be that Glasgow will be seen in the near future as the inflection point where suddenly the herd switched over from valuing fossil assets to abandoning them en masse, which means that essentially the fossil fuel holdings of these big companies will become worthless, and all of their assets, their infrastructure and so forth, is all very vulnerable. So that's, I think, getting some, in the last couple of years, has made a huge difference to how the big oil company, the oil majors anyway, think of things. Of course, it's leaving a lot of countries who depend on oil revenues wondering what their future holds and that kind of thing. But
have you had any dealings with Shell?
Well, I have done some work for them here and there. They under a previous boss, or maybe two previous bosses ago, they were very interested in moving out of fossil fuels and into carbon conservation investments, and indeed by prospecting biodiversity futures, all sorts of innovative stuff like that, ecotourism and things like this. And so I did some work for them in Sabah, in Malaysian Borneo, exploring that possibility of investing in simply new ways of keeping rainforest as natural rainforest, but finding new ways of making it really valuable to humanity, and with Shell taking a small cut on the way and making it happen. All of which was very positive. But then they changed their boss, and he announced that they were going to go back to their core business of fossil fuels, and that was that.
I mean, that is the challenge with large corporations. It's also the challenge with governments too. I mean, changes at the top, and that's it. The whole thing gets junked sometimes, which is very sad in a way. Now, the reason I asked the question about Shell is because my experience with them is that they have 20, 30-year scenarios that look down the pike. And you would think, well, that's so, then many of the issues that you've just touched upon would be plain to them. In other words, it's hard not to use the word, it's not rocket science. I mean, what you've been saying is straightforward, logical, rational, and you would have thought that that would have been uncovered in their 20, 30-year planning, but apparently not, if that's the case. Strikes me as very odd.
Ben was saying that the degree of awareness of big oil companies to the future vulnerability of their assets is reflected in the price that they give in their models to the future value of carbon. And ExxonMobil, for example, gives a relatively high price because it doesn't really believe all this green stuff.
That's right.
Whereas other companies give much lower prices. But the problem a problem, of course, is that there's so much money tied up in fossil fuel dependent businesses and pensions and all the rest of it that a sudden collapse in value would actually do a huge amount of damage to everybody's pension funds and a lot of things. So while I would argue, well, they should have realized that 10 years ago, or indeed back in 1992, all this was obvious, they should have taken steps. But in fact, they've left it, so it's all got very late. So they're bound to be worried about how to manage this transition at the very macro end of the who owns what. They really don't want to suddenly become poor at the big decision-making level, and they don't want a complete meltdown of anything. So they're going to have to manage it. I don't know how they do that, but I hope they're thinking about it because change is coming.
Well, you would like to think so, because that's what, dare I say it, that's what management gets paid the big bucks for. It is to manage these things, and you'd like to think they were doing so. Here's a question that's come in. Why do you think there have been such big increases in oil and gas prices? Is this simply Brexit related, or is there something more profound happening here?
Well, I'm not a petroleum economist or a market analyst. There's a lot of complexity going on with Russia and its gas supplies and so forth, and also demand as a result of COVID and the rebound. I think the rebound after COVID, where a year ago we were all saying, well, after COVID we've learned how to build back better, where we'll deliberately reduce our amount of fossil fuels we need and take advantage of this slowdown so we can create a new kind of economic system. There was a brief flash of optimism, and now we know that everybody's going back to where they were before and booming and demanding more oil, and therefore, because I guess they reduced the production of oil back in COVID days, there's now a shortfall in supply, and therefore the price has gone up. Plus, there are other things going on as well.
Yeah, well, you can understand why politicians get antsy when prices go up and they're looking at their votes and stuff like that. Right. Our time is almost up, Julian. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any last brief messages you would like to give to the people watching and listening tonight?
Blimey. Well, I would encourage you. I would encourage you to track down my article in the National on Sunday, because that makes, actually I put it on my website as well. But anyway, makes the case that there are 7 good reasons for Scotland to become independent. If that is its destiny, there are some good reasons for it, and so I would encourage you to research them. One of those reasons is that the world needs free and independent-minded Scots if it's ever going to be saved. And I think free independence is a good way to stimulate that kind of creativity and good thinking.
Thank you, Julian. That's been exceptional. I think we've all learned a lot from tonight. I know I certainly have. Thank you again. It's been 60 golden minutes as far as I'm concerned. A big thank you to Julian, and also a big thank you to all of you watching and listening tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this TNT show. As ever, we have a formidable lineup of guests in the future. As I always say, this is the place for the big hitters that you've learned tonight. And remember, in India Live, go to the What's On guide and you'll see who's coming up in the show in the weeks and months ahead. We're back next week with journalist Ian Bruce, award-winning journalist, I ought to add. He's here next week. And as always, look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National. Thanks again for joining us. Do join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Global Britain has metamorphosized into global sleaze right in front of our eyes. So to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe and take care, and we'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.
Great.